So in my last few videos, I have been laying out rhetorical devices that pertain to repetition. In this final video, I will be showing rhetorical devices that are somewhat more obscure in how one might apply them to music, but I nonetheless hope to show that it's not just the rhetorical principles of repetition that are applicable to music. First, let's consider the literary device known as the antithesis. An antithesis is a rhetorical device in which two opposing ideas are put together in a sentence to achieve a contrasting effect. A literary example of an antithesis is found at the very beginning of Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair.
If we were to apply this device to music, I feel one can often see Beethoven employ extremely contradictory or opposing musical passages within the same piece of music, such as in his King Stephen overture, where a dramatic beginning gives way to a whimsical flute melody. And if we continue, Beethoven's 22nd Piano Sonata in F major, often given the nickname of Beauty and the Beast, also displays two antithetical musical sections in its first movement. Although I personally don't particularly like the comparison of this piece to Beauty and the Beast, as it's not really the imagery I find fitting, I can still understand why some interpret these antithetical passages as such. One more example of an antithesis in Beethoven's music comes from the second movement of his Fourth Piano Concerto. These two opposing musical viewpoints have led to some speculation over whether the movement is programmatic in nature. The Beethoven biographer Adolf Bernhard Marx suggested that this movement is about Orpheus taming the Furies, whereby the piano represents Orpheus who subdues the vengeance-seeking Furies, which are represented by the unisono strings respectively. I'm also pretty sure I read at some point a musicologist that compared this movement to the biblical tale of David and Goliath. Although I can no longer find the source, but this is all just speculation anyhow. But I do feel this piece is at the very least a clear example of a musical antithesis. It's these kind of speculative theories that show how using this kind of a device in music can keep musicologists, biographers, and musicians guessing for centuries as to the correct interpretation or meaning of such musical passages. The next rhetorical device I wish to discuss is the Anacoluthon. This is the unexpected discontinuity of an expression of ideas within a sentence, leading to an amalgam of words in which there is an incoherence of thought. This often takes the form of a sentence that is interrupted midway through and continued with a different thought. This can at times give a stream of consciousness feeling in literature, as sometimes thoughts and ideas being expressed don't always come out coherently and smoothly. This can be an interesting device when applied to music because the sudden change or breaking off of a musical thought or clause can create added tension or drama to a piece, and even on rare occasions surprise the listener. In literature, this is seen in sentences broken off and continued differently than the initial syntax and grammar of the sentence suggests. An example of this comes in Milton's poem Lycidas.
Where were ye, nymphs, when the remorseless deep closed o'er the head of your love Lycidas? For neither were you playing on the steep where your old bards, the famous druids, lie, nor on the shaggy top of Mona high, nor yet where Diva spreads her wizard stream. Ay me, I fondly dream. Had ye been there, for what could that have done? What could the Muse herself that Orpheus bore, the Muse herself, for her enchanting son, whom universal nature did lament, when by the rout that made the hideous roar, his gory visage down the stream was sent, down the swift Hebrus to the Lesbian shore.
This is a somewhat obscure concept to grasp, but the principle should be understandable, as the sentence starts with a different grammatical structure than the way in which it is continued. So let's look once again at how one could apply this to music. And I feel there's a moment in Beethoven's 7th Symphony that shows this device in action very clearly. As you can hear and see, the whole structure and drive of the music is immediately transformed into something entirely different. This is incredibly useful as it adds suspense and drama to the music, as the listener wouldn't necessarily expect this sudden change in musical feeling or syntax. Another rhetorical term I feel one can apply to music is the Aposiopesis. This is defined by the breaking off of a sentence midway through. A simple example would be if we took the Caesar quote of "I came, I saw, I conquered" and removed the last word. Now we have an Aposiopesis, as the statement becomes incomplete. We can also see this in an expression like "get out or else." Or else what, one might ask. The whole purpose of this rhetorical device is exactly this, as the ambiguity of breaking off a statement leaves a lot to the imagination. I use this effect at the end of the third movement of my own piano trio. As you can see, this use of an Aposiopesis, or an incomplete musical statement, gives the ending an ambiguous feeling. I honestly did this on purpose because I wanted the listener to feel somewhat uneasy and also to understand subconsciously that the piece was still far from over, even though this singular movement had come to a complete end. This can be used to fulfill many other functions in music, as sometimes breaking off a musical thought can be just as effective as seeing a thought through to a conclusion. Before I conclude this series, there are two more rhetorical figures I'd like to discuss, this being the metaphor and the analogy. These two terms are often confused and mislabeled, often in English texts on rhetoric, and to be honest, if you do a quick Google search now and try to figure out the difference between these two devices, you might actually become fairly confused. I feel it can actually be quite simple to understand, and once again I feel that the Germans offer a clearer explanation of these two terms, and those definitions in turn make their application in music readily understandable. For German speakers, an analogy lays out a direct comparison between things, whereas a metaphor presents an indirect comparison. Let's look at two examples. The lamb's fleece was white as snow, and the lamb had cotton candy fleece. The first is a direct comparison and is thus an analogy. The whiteness of a sheep's fleece is directly compared to the whiteness of snow. The second, however, is a metaphor, as it is indirect in its comparison. This is more abstract, as it forces the reader to make more connections in their brain. For example, does the comparison apply only to the outward appearance of the lamb's fleece, or to the texture of the fleece as well? Perhaps more absurdly, the fleece is also sticky like cotton candy. It all ultimately depends on the context. This is why the metaphor is often seen in a more artistic light, as it requires more creativity from the writer along with the reader to develop a picture in their heads. So how do we see these two devices used in music? In music, the term tone painting is often used to describe when composers sonically mimic non-musical things in programmatic music. Some of the greatest examples of this comes in Schubert's Lieder, or songs. Let's take a listen to his famous song Die Forelle, or The Trout as it's translated in English.
In einem Bächlein helle, da schoss in froher Eil die launische Forelle.
Schubert directly evokes a slippery jumping trout in the piano accompaniment. I could use a metaphor to describe the music, as one could almost say it sounds slippery. However, I feel many forms of tone painting are actually musical analogies, as they are direct in how they evoke the implied subject matter. Schubert is an absolute master of this, be it the galloping of a horse in haste in Der Erlkönig, or the placid shimmering of water in Auf dem Wasser zu singen. So, although we can often describe such programmatic music in a metaphorical way, the music itself is not metaphorical, as it's direct in its evocations. The brain is not forced to make as many connections with musical analogies, as the music itself is quite clear in what it's mimicking. So this leaves the question of when music that is programmatic in nature becomes metaphorical. Well, consider that the comparison, as in literature, must be indirect, so thus the listener or reader must imagine the comparisons themselves. We can see this in Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, a work meant to sonically instill the imagery of an idyllic countryside into the mind of the listener. In contrast to most of Beethoven's symphonies, his Sixth is substantially slower, smoother, and more subdued in its character. In fact, many of the characteristics of this symphony harken back to the Pastoral, which was a form of Baroque instrumental music written in a slow tempo in a major key, and often in a 12/8 or 6/8 time signature. Often this form of music employs the drone or bourdon bass, which is the holding of a single note or perfect fifth beneath the melody. This imitates aspects of countryside instruments such as the hurdy-gurdy or bagpipes, which employ drone tones. And sure enough, right at the beginning of the Sixth Symphony, Beethoven employs a drone. This is an indirect comparison, as it requires the listener to make the connection between the application of a drone and the countryside instruments that employ it. The Pastoral, although meant to idealize the countryside, is not analogous in its comparison to the countryside, but rather metaphorical in mimicking the idealistic feeling of being in the countryside, be it through the implied jollity of a major key, or the laid-back feeling of the slow tempo. In some form or another, Beethoven uses all the aspects of the Baroque pastoral throughout his Sixth Symphony. Obviously, there are passages of the symphony which use analogies, such as the storm section, which is quite direct in what it is trying to represent, but for the most part we should rely on Beethoven's own description of the Sixth, when he stated that the piece is more the expression of feeling than painting. This implies that Beethoven felt the piece was more direct in its programmatic nature, and thus, for the sake of my argument, more of a musical metaphor, as the feelings and visuals this piece wishes to evoke are mostly indirect in nature, as it requires the listener to make more abstract connections in their brain. Let's move on to another example of a musical metaphor, which is seen in Schubert's song Der König in Thule. This song is based off a text by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and refers to a king of a faraway ancient mythical kingdom, so let's take a listen. Notice anything odd about the beginning? It has an ancient feeling to it, doesn't it? An untrained eye or ear might not notice what achieves this effect though, so feel free to pause the video and try to figure out why this music might sound so ancient. If you didn't figure it out, here's the answer. In an odd departure from typical late classical and early romantic tendencies, the melodic line of this piece is written in the Dorian mode. We can determine this based off of the absence of the determining B flat in the melodic line, which in most classical and romantic pieces would remain present, as it cements the defining characteristic of D minor in which this piece is notated. Schubert, however, adapts the harmonies of the piano accompaniment to work with the Dorian mode sung over it. This is actually extremely uncommon, if not nearly non-existent in Schubert's time. The use of an archaic Gregorian mode implies indirectly something ancient and far away from the here and now of when the piece was written, and thus illustrates, in my opinion, another musical metaphor, as the music is indirectly implying an abstract aspect of the text's subject matter. This is where we enter the realm of rhetoric, leaving a concrete, definable thing in music, and into the creative realm, whereby the composer and musician must be more than just a bookworm, but also creative in their usage of rhetoric, and their understanding of how music is about far more than just technique and theory. There are so many rhetorical devices, and I feel a great deal more of them can be translated into music. I often hear that music is a language, but yet we often ignore how comparable it can actually be to language. I must, however, concede that there is very little evidence after the Baroque period that composers actively employed rhetorical devices in their compositions. Not disclosing this to you, my audience, would be intellectually dishonest, as the point of these videos is not predicated on proving rhetoric as a valuable and essential part of composition, but rather as a way to view, understand, and interpret music differently. My personal opinion is that using rhetorical devices can only help a composer more than harm them, but you don't have to agree with me. However, most composers of the past were well versed in poetry and literature, so it's hard to dispel the notion that they were wholly ignorant of rhetoric. But there still remains little tangible proof that composers did these things on purpose and actively considered rhetorical devices while composing. But just because it isn't a provable concrete fact that composers employed rhetorical figures intentionally, doesn't mean it should be entirely ignored. A wise composer of the past was educated in more than just the fundamentals of music. This is something I explained in my video on being more than just a composer. Imagine a great orator or writer being only knowledgeable of grammar. I mean, this is obviously absurd. Thus, it is equally absurd to assume a composer who masters only music theory will produce music of any value whatsoever. But in the end, this series of videos was meant as a key to a realm of musical understanding about which you may have previously been unaware. I will leave it to you, the viewer, to continue the journey in your own way, as I did after I was made aware of how one can interpret music rhetorically. Shortly after I was made aware of how one could use rhetorical devices in music, I printed out a list of about 50 some odd rhetorical figures. This printout has remained on the music rack of my piano ever since. Whether I'm composing or practicing, it's always there in the corner of my eye. I slowly began to realize that so many stupendously over-specific music terms could be simplified by just exchanging them out for rhetorical terms, and thus somewhat removing the mystique behind music. I feel this realization has had a profound effect on how I compose, but that's just my personal experience. You don't have to take everything I say in these videos as absolute proofs. In fact, you shouldn't. A wise person should always question what they are told, no matter how established an idea is or how much of a consensus is built around something. Take this series as my personal advice on just another way to interpret and compose music, and by no means should you now proceed to go around telling your peers about how Chopin and Beethoven used rhetoric as if it were a fact. The truth is we don't know for sure, so take what I have laid out here as interpretive in nature and helpful in understanding music in a new and different way. I truly feel whether you're a composer or a musician that it will ultimately open more doors in your creative journey.